Hi, I'm Alan Hedblum. Welcome to our show, a place to feel like you belong. During our conversation, you'll notice words and phrases appearing at the bottom of the screen. After our dialogue, stay tuned for a follow-up segment called Would You Say?, where we'll explain some of the difficult slang and cultural concepts that you heard. A complete list will be given on our website for the conversation with today's date. For now, let's welcome today's guest. I'd like to welcome to our studio today, Kyle Lim. Kyle is the Marketing and Fundraising Coordinator at Tall Turf Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Kyle, welcome to Feel Like You Belong.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. So you come from the country of Singapore,
Yeah.
which is half a world away.
Yep.
How does a person from a country of 5 million find Grand Rapids, Michigan?
It's a pretty convoluted story, actually, but one of my friends' father was the academic advisor at an international school that I was attending in Indonesia. And when I graduated from high school and I went back to Singapore for the military service, he was coming through Singapore and actually started asking me about what my plans were for after I got done with the Army. And I informed him that I didn't really have any plans. I hadn't done that well in school and wasn't really eligible to go to college in Singapore. So he told me about this school in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is where he was from Michigan. And he said, you know, they have this program that is offering, or they have a school there that's offering a program that you're interested in, international development. So I applied to Calvin College and actually ended up coming here in 2008. So.
Okay. So now Singapore is a very diverse place.
Yes.
So you've got Malays, you've got Chinese, there are British there, there are Indians there. How does that work? 'Cause over millennia, people get a little cranky and contentious and don't always get along. How does Singapore work?
I think that Singapore was that diversity is sort of built into its DNA. So it's a trading port, and that's originally what it was founded as. So it's always had a lot of different people. When we gained independence from the British in the 1960s, as the country was kind of coming into its own, I think that its leadership saw it as essential that they build the sort of appreciation and tolerance into our national identity. So in our national pledge, you know, we talk about the need to appreciate people from all races and the need for racial harmony.
And that works.
And it works. We, in Singapore, there's at least an awareness of different cultures, I would say. So in school, when I was growing up, we didn't just have holidays for Christmas or Easter, but we had time off for Chinese New Year, which is a Chinese holiday, and Hari Raya, which is a Malay holiday, or Deepavali. So there's an acceptance of a variety of beliefs and acknowledgement, at least, of different ways of doing things and such, that I think really brings a kind of collective identity rather than different ethnic identities.
Were your classmates diverse?
Yeah, my school was, I would say, predominantly Chinese, but some of my best friends growing up were Indian or Malay too. So I would say, I mean, Singapore is about 55. I think it is 55% ethnically Chinese. So I would say it's pretty proportionate to the community that we were living in. But,
okay.
Yeah.
And then you ended up at Calvin College, which is 8 out of 10 students are Anglo.
Yeah.
How does that work? And half of the diversity at Calvin, I was reading, is from the international students.
Right.
Yeah. So how does that feel going from your home situation to this new environment?
Yeah, it was a big transition for me, I think. One of the characteristics of Singapore, so there are Anglo people or Caucasian people in Singapore, but they're pretty few and far between. And in the public schools, which is where I went to school, it's even less so. So I kind of stood out in Singapore as one of the only, white boys in my class and whatnot. But suddenly, when I came to Calvin, phenotypically at least, I fit in. I was a member of the majority, so people would kind of relate to me on that level. But culturally, in terms of where I come from and the way that I view the world, I'm not a white American, So I think that was a pretty jarring experience to have people relate to you with that expectation.
Well, they're making assumptions about you.
Right, or making assumptions about you, but then not knowing quite on what plane do I relate with them. So I think that was a rough transition for me.
Do you have an example, a story?
Yeah, so I have this pretty vivid memory of being in. Must have been a freshman or something, and we were in the basement of my dorm or my dormitory, and some of my friends started talking about the show Full House, which is an American sitcom, and they were kind of saying, joking around, saying, "Oh, you're like so and so from the show, and you're like this character, or you're like that character," and they finally got to me, and they said, "Kyle, you're like Bob Saget." And I said, "I don't know who Bob Saget is." And I remember this. One of my friends looked at me in the eye, dead in the eye, and said, "Kyle, everybody knows who Bob Saget is."
Wow.
And so I just remember thinking in that context, well, how do I fit into this if the expectation is for me to know these things, but I don't know them? Mm-hmm. So it created, I think, some friction there in terms of how I related to people. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. People who track you online see that you are following, for example, HAPA blogs.
Yeah.
And your own Twitter subtitle is "Make Mulattos Not War."
Yeah.
What's that about?
I think that coming to the U.S. has made me a little bit more overt about my mixed identity. So my father is Chinese and my mother is Dutch Canadian. And I had never really had to think about the fact that I was not just Singaporean when I was in Singapore. But coming to the U.S., especially with all these sort of conforming pressures to be a white American, those kind of identity sort of conflicts have really led me to embrace sort of this mixed race identity, because I'm not just a white American, but how do I relate to the world then? Well, I've found online, especially on Twitter, that there's a growing mixed voice and one that I have really come to identify with. So that's kind of what drove me, and I always like to be a little bit edgy, so I think maybe the Twitter heading might explain that.
Made me smile when I read that.
Yeah.
So your name seems to me an embodiment of that very issue.
Sure.
Kyle sounds like a very Anglo kind of name.
Right.
Lim is Chinese.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what have you learned in this digital conversation with people from around the country and maybe around the world about identity?
I think that one of the key takeaways that I've been able to glean from that conversation is that identity is very complex, and it's not as cut and dry as society oftentimes leads us to believe, especially in the context of race and ethnicity. So it's been it's been good for me to be able to be a part of these conversations online, because I've realized that a lot of the questions and issues that I grapple with are ones that are shared across the board.
You're not alone.
I'm not alone, and that at the same time, there are people who are thinking and grappling and pushing forward with trying to make a place for people, especially people with either mixed experiences or people that just might not fit into the traditional boxes.
So the U.S. is still currently an Anglo or Caucasian majority country. Those numbers are evolving, and I think by mid-century, those numbers are actually going to tip. So non-Europeans will be in the racial ethnic majority.
Right.
You and your wife Claire, who is, we should say, is a Dutch American person, and you have chosen to live in a particular neighborhood in Grand Rapids. Tell us about that and your reasoning.
So we live in the Baxter neighborhood of Grand Rapids, which is a historically, actually, African-American community in the city. It was originally where house servants from people who lived up on the hill, the furniture tycoons, lived, and so that was sort of how that community came into being, and it's been a predominantly black community since that time. So that's where we decided to live, and I think that the reasons why were manyfold. One of them being neither of us make that much money, and it's a cheap place to live. For two, I was currently working at Baxter Community Center, which is just down the street for us. But I think one of the biggest reasons that we wanted to live in a community that didn't look like us was to make us more perhaps aware of the kind of culture that we live in. I think that as at least phenotypically white members of society, it's too easy sometimes to just become complacent with cultural norms or cultural standards that are placed upon people. So in living in a community where most of our neighbors don't share those same cultural norms or standards, it really makes you have to think about the things that you're doing or why you're doing what you're doing.
So what is living in the Baxter community teaching you?
I think it's teaching me that there's a lot that I don't know about people. I think that even having a international background, sometimes you think, oh, you learn how to relate to people cross-culturally, at least on a superficial level, fairly easily. But I think that being immersed in the Baxter community has really begun to teach me that there are a lot of layers to people that you can't figure out from a chance meeting, or even just by watching what they watch or studying what they study. You know, that it takes a relationship and vulnerability for those things to really be learned. So.
And international diversity and comfort and competence doesn't necessarily equate to domestic diversity and understanding.
I would absolutely agree, and that there sometimes in the context of the U.S., it's harder to relate domestically across cultural lines than it is to relate cross-culturally across international lines.
Well, and I think the issues also get conflated with issues of class.
Absolutely.
For example.
Absolutely.
And that's not always the case when you're dealing internationally.
Right.
Sure. We need to wrap up here in a moment, but tell me a little bit about your work. In particular, there's a project called Reimagine at work.
Yeah, so Reimagining Diversity is actually not a part of Tall Turf, but it's one of my side jobs.
Okay.
But I think that the impetus for Reimagining Diversity is really to take a look at what are some of the inhibitors to the conversations that have been happening around diversity and inclusion, and how can we rethink the way that either we have those conversations, or the way that we structure them, in order to really be able to achieve some of the goals that diversity and inclusion work sets out to achieve. So the goal of equity, or whatever it might be, governed by your values, that somehow in the conversations that we have around diversity and inclusion, they don't always get us to where we want to be. So I think that reimagining diversity is part of that, and I'm currently working on the youth component of that. So how do we adapt conversations about cultural intelligence or cultural competency towards a younger audience?
And is there a website that our viewers can check out?
For Reimagining Diversity, I believe that it's reimaginediversity.org, but
we'll do our homework and put it up on our website for our viewers. Okay. So last question.
Yeah.
How does belonging happen?
I think that it happens through vulnerability, for one. I think that what I've learned, especially in these conversations about mixed identity, is that you often have to be vulnerable with people in order for them to really begin to appreciate who you are. But that vulnerability has to happen on both sides of the coin. So people have to be willing to say that you have something to offer, or that you have an experience that's different than them, as well as you have to be willing to offer of that yourself. So I think that it's a twofold conversation that oftentimes has to do a lot with vulnerability.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. We're going to have to wrap it up here, but I want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story with us and with our viewers today.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. And for you at home, please join us in just a moment where we share our segment called What'd You Say? You heard Kyle say, cut and dried. This is an expression that means strictly defined, something that's fixed, that's set. It's not really open for negotiation or flexibility. Another expression you heard Kyle say was two sides of the same coin. Now this means that there are two different ways to look at the same issue. If there were other expressions that you heard that puzzled you during the interview with Kyle, check out our webpage under the What'd You Say section. Earlier this year, Barbara Kochanek, age 72, had a dream come true. She became a U.S. citizen. The previous year, she had all but given up on this dream. An immigrant from Poland, Barbara didn't speak English very well, and she was certain she couldn't pass the citizenship test. That was before workers at the International Institute of Metropolitan Detroit walked her through the process. They even picked her up, she doesn't drive, and took her to appointments and even found a translator for her. This came about because of a coalition of agencies called the Detroit New Americans Campaign, which provides pro bono assistance to help green card holders complete their applications for citizenship. The best news of all, because she is a senior citizen, Barbara met the criteria to take her exam in Polish, her native language. Ever since coming to the United States, that had been her dream, to become a U.S. citizen. In addition to the right to vote, there are scores of other benefits that Barbara will no longer worry about. Access to programs like supplemental security income and Medicare, the ability to travel outside the U.S. on her passport, and many, many others, according to Susan Reed, the supervising attorney with the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center. Free citizenship workshops are offered in Metro Detroit. For more information, visit the website of the Detroit New Americans Campaign at detroitnac.org. Now, to apply for citizenship, you'll need a number of items. your permanent resident card, 2 passport photos, a driver's license or state ID, Social Security number, all marriage certificates and divorce records, children's birth certificates, a list of residences for the past 5 years, a list of employers and schools for the past 5 years, a list of each trip taken outside the United States, and finally, a check for $680 payable to the Department of Homeland Security. In the meantime, we offer a hearty welcome to Barbara Kochanek, one of our newest fellow citizens. As we've discussed on previous shows, one difficult aspect of learning a second language is adapting to humor that involves plays on words. These are also called puns. Now, I'm a big fan of puns and actually tell a lot of them with my friends and family. The way many Americans receive a pun when it is told to them is to pretend they didn't think it was funny. They may just stare at the pun teller or even let out a groan. They don't want to give punsters like me credit for clever wordplay. But usually they end up smiling or even laughing sometimes. Here's a clever wordplay that most Americans would chuckle over. The question is it funny to you? An invisible man married an invisible woman. Their kids were nothing to look at either. Did you laugh? This joke involves an English idiom and a double meaning. If you didn't get the joke, check out our What's So Funny webpage for the explanation.